The book of Mark has been called a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Despite being the shortest of all the Gospels, Mark has the most material on the last days of Jesus' life. 40% of the book are devoted to the last 7 days of Jesus' life, and for good reason. Remember, Mark opens his book in the prologue, the first 15 verses, by telling us exactly who Jesus is. He is the Son of God who is beloved by the Father, just like Abraham loved his son Isaac, who would be sacrificed up on a mountain, but then delivered from death. And Jesus is the Son who is pleasing to the Father, like the suffering servant is pleasing to God in Isaiah 53. However, this concept of a dying Messiah is so far from the minds of Israel, now under the thumb of Rome, that Jesus finds it necessary to squash any expectations of the coming Messiah here in chapters 1 through 8, because Israel is blind to his mission to come and die on their behalf. And unfortunately, the disciples are equally blind to Jesus's self-sacrificial, humble mission, demonstrating that they have more of a Roman view of greatness than a messianic one. But now, in chapters 11 to 16, the Son of Man is going to exercise true greatness by not being served, but rather by serving and giving his life as a ransom for many on the cross. And for that, he is going to have to return to Jerusalem. And here in chapters 11 to 13, he's going to make 3 trips, 3 separate visits to that all-important city, challenging the authorities of those leaders in Jerusalem and provoking them to respond, begging them to attack. So here in this first visit, it is our triumphal entry, an amazing portion of Scripture. Look at here we are. The crowds, they're spreading their cloaks on the ground. They're putting down leafy branches and they're shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." I mean, they're basically calling him king, inviting him to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. How radically different is this from chapters 1 to 8, where Jesus is silencing anyone who would call him Messiah, call him Son of God, silencing the demons. But here, in the triumphal entry, there's no attempt to silence that open pronouncement that he is the Son of David, when in fact this is Passover, you guys. Tens of thousands of people have gathered in this city, and Jesus rides into it as their king on a donkey. This is his first public disclosure of himself to Israel as Messiah. He's not going to conceal himself at all. The secret is out, and it's only going to get better here in Jesus' second trip to the city, where he will cleanse the temple. He enters into it and he overturns the tables of the money changers, the seats of those who sold pigeons. And look at this, verse 16, only recorded in the Gospel of Mark. He would not allow anyone even to carry anything through the temple, to disrespect that space with their commerce. Why is that? Well, in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, it says that the Lord whom you look for will suddenly come into his temple. And then in Ezekiel, chapters, I think it's 43, it says that the Messiah's throne will be in the temple. You see, Jesus, he had a right to that space. That was his temple. And so on Sunday, he will triumphantly ride into the city. On Monday, he will cleanse the temple and prevent people even from carrying anything there. And then on Tuesday, the third visit to the temple, he will challenge the entire city to a debate. And again, before the watching eyes of the nations, he will challenge the authority of Jerusalem's leadership and basically just embarrass them. You remember this account. There's this back and forth within the temple precincts where the scribes and Pharisees ask, "By what authority do you do these things?" And Jesus says, "Well, what authority did John baptize in the wilderness?" And they're like, "Oh man, that's a good one." And then Jesus lobs a bunch of parables at them. And then they lob a bunch of questions at Jesus, attempting to discredit him, but Jesus answers everyone with flying colors. Really quite amazing. Now, one of those questions is of interest. Oh, great teacher, should we pay taxes to Caesar or should we not? In light of our earlier discussion on Roman coins, isn't it interesting that Jesus says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's? I think this is one last little jab here by Mark showing us who is the true Son of God. That is Jesus, not Caesar. Well, instead of concluding this little back and forth exchange with 7 woes like Matthew does in chapter 23 of that book, Mark is going to conclude this confrontation with Jerusalem's leadership with one warning. This is kind of an interesting one. Take a look at this, demonstrating the how bad Israel's leadership is. So let's jump down to 1238. So this warning is kind of a summation of Matthew's woes, where he says, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in marketplaces and to have the best seats in synagogues, the places of honor. They want to be first, don't they? They don't follow their own Messiah who demonstrates greatness by being a servant and a slave of all. But then look at this next line. These scribes devour widows' houses. They devour widows' houses. And it's no surprise, it's no coincidence that the very next sentence is about one such widow whose house is just being devoured. She puts in 2 small coins, a single penny. Despite being extremely poor, she gives everything she has. Her house is now devoured. It is empty, consumed by the barons of the temple. And I think I would argue that these short verses are not a celebration of her courageous generosity, though that is true, but rather Mark has placed this account here right after this phrase about widows' houses being devoured as a condemnation of the injustice of Israel's shepherds, their leaders who are just crushing the people into dust. And I think that this interpretation is confirmed by the very next account, which is Jesus's Olivet Discourse, in which he pronounces judgment on the scribes' collection agency, which is the temple. You see, just like the prophets of old, Jesus is going to pronounce judgment on the temple. Now, however, Jesus's Olivet Discourse in Mark 13 is within the context of the tribulation and the future second coming of Jesus. And this judgment, which he pronounces on Tuesday, is actually anticipated on Monday, the previous days, when he curses a fig tree. Remember that? Let's take a look at that. Jump back to Monday with me, which is Mark 11:13, when he first he rides into the city triumphantly. That's visit 1. And then on the next day, visit number 2, he sees a fig tree, but it is a fruitless fig tree. There's no figs on it. And he curses it. May you never have fruit on you again. And the following day, he sees that the fig tree has withered away to its roots. But curiously, Mark is going to separate the cursing of the fig tree from its judgment, its destruction, with the account of Jesus cleansing the temple. And that's not what Matthew does. Take a look at Matthew's account of this same event in Matthew 21, where it says that he sees a fig tree, he goes to it, it's barren, not producing any fruit, so he curses it, and the fig tree withered at once. There you go. The very next sentence. Why then does Mark separate it with the account of the cleansing of the temple? Well, this is one example of a literary technique that Mark's quite good at. It's called, or scholars have called it, the Markan sandwich, in which one account or narrative is going to be spliced by a separate one, and those two stories are going to interpret one another. They're going to have a conversation between them and mutually explain each of those accounts. Take a look at some examples of these Markan sandwiches. I hope I'm not making you hungry for a deli sub here. So Jesus is going to curse the fig tree, it's going to wither, but in between we have the cleansing of the temple. And of course, what's going on here is Jesus is cursing the temple. Let's look at another example. Remember that curious example of Jairus' father coming to Jesus, pleading with him, please heal my daughter. But then a woman with a bleeding issue comes up to him. Jesus heals her first, and then goes back and heals Jairus' daughter. And in both cases, the faith of this woman and Jairus is highlighted. So their faith is even made more prominent by placing these stories side by side. And then Jesus is going to send out the 12, and then the 12 are going to come back. But in between, we have the account of the death of John the Baptist, teaching us that this future mission of Jesus' apostles is going to be costly. It's going to require them to carry their cross and even to die, just like John the Baptist did. And then one final example, we have the scribes and Pharisees, and scribes and priests plotting Jesus' death. And then we have Judas betraying Jesus and basically plotting his death. And in between, Jesus is going to be anointed. And I think that Mark is teaching us that Jesus' path to reigning as the Messianic King, Messiah, it means the anointed one, is going to be through his death. And I think that this Markan sandwich here helps us to understand Mark's unique exaltation of the woman who anoints Jesus here in Mark chapter 14. It's really an amazing and kind of random account, isn't it? Remember how she's exalted in Mark 14, verse 9? Jump back to Mark 14:9, where this woman who anoints Jesus in Bethany, it says that, truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed throughout the whole world, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her. What an exaltation of this poor, nameless woman. And why is she exalted in this way? Because she is the only one who gets it. The only one in the entire book of Mark to this point who knows that Jesus must go to the cross. She sees him as king, but also as the suffering servant. Jesus says of her that she anointed my body for burial. She knew that he must die. And then in this one amazing action, we have this unity of Jesus's royal identity as king, as the Messiah, and his mission of one who has come to die as a ransom for many. It's really an astonishing story. Well, Mark's purpose with these chapters 14 and 15, is really just to continue what this woman started. And to demonstrate that Jesus' identity as King of Israel was made most plain, most clear here at the cross. On the cross, where Jesus was betrayed by one of his own, where he was abandoned by his closest friend, and where he was denied by the leader of his movement, by Peter himself. And how many times was he denied? Do you remember that? He was denied 3 times, an example of one of Mark's beloved triads. There are these triads all over the book of Mark. 3 denials of Jesus by Peter, and then 3 trips to the temple we just saw, 3 passion predictions in chapters 8 through 10, and even 3 boat scenes in 1 through 8. But again, Jesus, he will be denied 3 times. He will be condemned at an unjust trial, and then he will die a torturous death in darkness, mocked by those around him, rejected by his nation, and even forsaken by God. Remember what he cries? My God, why have you forsaken me? But as Mark Strauss has put so well, for those with eyes of faith, this is no tragedy, but rather it is the way in which Jesus became king. You see, the book of Mark is all about the identity of Jesus, this merging of suffering servant and exalted Son of God. Look at these statements of Jesus' identity made throughout the entire book. Of course, the most central ones are those which identify him as the Son of God, made several times. But we see throughout the book, the disciples and Israel, they struggle to understand who is this Jesus, the Christ, but then also he who must suffer. But then look here at chapters 14 and 15 and how frequently Jesus is identified as the King of the Jews. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? What shall I do with this man whom you call the King of the Jews? Even the soldiers, as they mock him, they proclaim a truth, saying that he is the King of the Jews. The inscription there on the cross read, King of the Jews. And even the chief priests and scribes, as they mocked him, said, let the Christ, the King of the Jews, come down from that cross. But it is here at the cross when Jesus will breathe his last that his true identity will be spoken on the lips of a human for the first time. The first time that a man will say that he is the Son of God will not be from Peter or from one of the disciples, but rather from a Roman centurion who will say, truly, this man was the Son of God. And this is a critical moment in the book of Mark. Really part of a 3-part design of the entire book, where here in the beginning, we have Jesus' baptism, where the heavens are torn open, just like the curtain is torn in two at Jesus' crucifixion. The Spirit descends on Jesus, just like a cloud overshadows him at his transfiguration, and darkness falls on the land at the crucifixion. The Spirit is like a dove that is a bright white bird, just like Jesus' own clothes became intensely white at the transfiguration. And then a voice speaks from heaven 2 times, and Jesus utters a loud cry from the cross. And twice Jesus is called Son of God by the Father, and then the centurion also identifies that this man was the Son of God. For you cannot know Jesus apart from his death. However, we know that Jesus didn't stay dead. 3 days later, just like he said he would, he walked out of that tomb, leaving it empty when those 3 women went and visited the tomb. Take a look at how Mark ends his book. It's kind of curious. What is the ending of the book of Mark? Let's make this a little bit bigger here. The 3 women, Mary, the other Mary, Salome, they came to the tomb and they're asking, man, who's going to roll away the stone for us? But when they get there, there's a young man sitting on the right side of the tomb, dressed in white. And he says, don't be afraid. You seek Jesus, but he is risen. Go tell the disciples, go tell Peter. And he's going ahead to Galilee before you. However, what did the women do? They flee from the tomb, trembling in astonishment seizes them, and they say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that is how the book of Mark ends. What kind of an ending is that? With the women afraid and telling no one. Well, we are going to discuss Mark's curious ending in our last lecture on the book of Mark next.